He is recognized as one of the global top 100 most influential people of African descent in politics and governance. Dr. Chevy Eugene is a cross-pointed assistant professor in the Black and African Diaspora Studies program and the Department of Political Science at Dalhousie University. Dr. Eugene's research takes up the historical struggles for reparations by conceptualizing it as a liberation praxis for conquest, enslavement, colonialism, and neocolonialism in new world-making in the Caribbean context. It proposes a decolonial reparations framework that seeks to delink demands for reparations from neoliberal epistemologies and mechanisms that perpetuate the continuation of neocolonial governmentalities in the Caribbean. Additionally, his research explores the role of the arts and social movements in the politicization and mobilization of young people in the Caribbean and its diasporas on the issue of reparatory justice. His current project argues for the colonial and holistic undertaking of reparations in Canada by connecting the contemporary manifestations of anti-Black systemic racism to transatlantic slavery. Furthermore, he has undertaken various consultancy projects, most notably with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to assist states and other key partners to deliver reparations for people of African descent through a human rights and intersectional approach. His professional involvement extends beyond academia. Dr. Eugene serves as the Caribbean ambassador for the Pan-African Council and the Canadian and Caribbean representative for the International Coalition for People of African Descent. Today, his presentation is going to focus on reparatory justice in the context of Canada. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings and salutations, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the working group for inviting me to speak on Black Canadian experiences. And I also want to give a special shout out to my colleague and friend, Isabel Mamadou, on her new appointment. So thank you once more, and thank you everyone for being there today. So I appreciate that. So today, like I mentioned, I'll be speaking on reparations from a Canadian perspective. The title of my talk is called Locating Canada in the Global Reparations Movement. So Hilary Beckles argues that the reparation movement is the most significant political tide of the 21st century due to how the redress phenomenon has become embedded globally in popular culture and political discourse. For instance, in the last few U.S. federal elections, the topic of reparations for transatlantic slavery was taken up by the primary candidates for the Democratic, Republican, and Green parties. In the Global South, the Caribbean Community CARICOM has been the leading institution in revitalizing conversations on reparations from a transnational perspective. The Caribbean Regional Bloc has renewed collaborations with the African Union, as was mentioned earlier on by my colleague. The African Union on seeking justice for the historical wrongs committed against people of African descent via slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. In the case of South America, the current Colombian government is the driving force in exercising the practicality of redress in the case of land rights for indigenous people and Afro-Colombians. Equally important, the government-led undertakings of reparative justice I have highlighted were all fueled by local and international grassroots movements, right? However, in the global climate of reparative justice, or one can argue on new world-making, Canada occupies a peripheral position in this historical moment. I am not implying that discussions or actions regarding reparative justice are absent within Canada. Instead, I assert that such efforts do not occur nationally. Therefore, my talk today, I would like to explore the question, how can reparations for transatlantic slavery and its legacies be undertaken in Canada as a national project? To reinforce my main argument, my presentation consists of 3 sections. The first section briefly outlines enslavement in Canada. The second discusses how the legacies of slavery contribute to the ongoing weather of anti-black racism. And the final section presents a 12-point plan for implementing reparations as a national initiative in Canada. So then, why advocate for reparations for Black Canadians, right? And to be honest, if you, as someone who's been living in Canada for 22 years, originally from the beautiful island of St. Lucia, in my travels speaking with Black communities from Canada, people are always surprised to know that Black people exist in Canada, right? Even some students not understanding the history that Canadians have been there for Black Canadians, I should say, have been there for 7+8 generations, right? So there's a strong history of African presence in Canada, right? So there's a common misunderstanding that African enslavement did not take place in Canada, as the nation was often seen as the promised land for Africans escaping slavery in the United States. For instance, Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad had some of its final stops in Canada. Numerous Black communities were established during that period and in many cases still exist today. Nova Scotia, Canada, is home to 52 historical Black communities, some of which have ancestral connections to the US. It is also crucial to recognize that upon their arrival in Canada, Black individuals continue to face the harsh realities of anti-Black racism, evident in segregated schools, inequalities within the healthcare system, and other barriers which contradicted the notion of the promised land. There were instances where the freed Africans will return to the US due to the violence of anti-Black racism. This repatriation will later be called the Reverse Underground Railroad. Afua Cooper states in the slideshow, as we see here, slavery is Canada's best-kept secret, locked within the national closet. And because it is a secret, it is written out of official history. But slavery was an official practice for over 200 years. She continues, Canada might not have been a slave society, that is, a society whose economy was based on slavery, but it was a society with slaves. As much as the master narrative of the Canadian nation tends to negate the history of slavery, the inhumane practice was Canadian as much as it was American or West Indian. The recorded enslavement of Black people in Canada began with a 9-year-old boy from Madagascar, Olivier Lejeune, in 1628. He was owned by a Quebec clerk who eventually sold him when the French colony was taken over by the English pirates. The enslaved in Canada engaged in a variety of occupations, from rat catcher to hangman, but most worked as house servants, as farm laborers, or in skilled occupants. The enslaved faced torture and death, exemplified by Marie-Jean Angelique, who was executed following a false accusation of setting fire to a significant portion of Montreal, Old Montreal. Enslaved African labor formed a crucial part of Canada's history. The church, nobility, merchants, lawyers, government officials, gentry, soldiers, tavern keepers, farmers, business people, and artisans all owned enslaved Africans. Collectively, the merchant elite possessed the most significant number of enslaved persons. In 2019, my place of employment, Dalhousie University, put together the report on Lord Dalhousie's history on slavery and race. The research identified 5 key areas regarding Lord Dalhousie and the university's relationship with race, slavery, and anti-Black racism. And to be fair, from that report, a lot of initiatives came out. For example, I am, besides being in the Department of Political Science at DAL, I'm part of the Black and African Diasporic Studies program, which came out as a result of the research that was conducted by Lord Dalhousie report. All right? It also suggested ways to address and mend the connection with Black communities in Nova Scotia. In essence, Canada embodied a contradiction of freedom and enslavement. As my colleagues and civil society members have reiterated this week, the enslavement of Africans did not conclude with the emancipation. The very foundation of the modern world is established on what bell hooks call white supremacist capital patriarchy, which permeates the socio-political and economic tapestry of the contemporary modern world. In the case of Canada, the notion has been described as one of the one that exuberates the practices of democratic racism, which is the ideology that allows racist beliefs to persist alongside democratic values. It obscures and justifies those contradictions, showcasing an allegiance to egalitarian principles while simultaneously undermining them. The demolition of Africville in Halifax, Nova Scotia, demonstrates the interconnectedness of democracy and racism in perpetuating anti-black systemic racism. Africville was a historic black community started in the early 19th century by descendants of enslaved Africans and black loyalists. Despite facing discrimination, Africville thrived as a self-sustaining community. However, residents had limited access to services like water and paved roads and encountered prejudice. In the 1960s, city redevelopment projects destroyed Africville, forcibly relocating residents and demolishing homes for industrial developments. The destruction severely impacted the community, causing loss of homes and identity, right? So before you had that beautiful term, what's it called? Gentrification, right? You had the complete destruction of black communities, right? And we could think of examples as well in the US. A recent example where we can observe a response to democratic racism is in 2024, a class action lawsuit against the federal government claiming discrimination by a collective of black servants. This lawsuit involves approximately 45,000 individuals employed in the federal government since 1970. They're pursuing $2.5 billion Canadian dollars in compensation for loss of wages and pensions. The plaintiffs highlight extensive discrimination within the public service, referencing findings of anti-black racism report by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, along with an internal report concerning discrimination of the Privy Council Office. They contend that black public servants have faced systemic barriers in hiring and promotional opportunities due to their race, contributing to a hostile work environment and underrepresentation of black individuals in senior positions. Numerous reports, research, and creative projects highlight the prevalence of anti-black systemic racism affecting black individuals in Canadian society. But for now, I want to direct your focus to the proposed 12-point plan for implementing reparations as a national initiative in Canada. Right. The principles of this proposed 12-point plan stem from years of dialogue with community leaders and members, alongside extensive research conducted by experts and activists in various fields focused on tackling anti-black systemic racism in Canada. Furthermore, it was influenced by CARICOM's agenda on how the Caribbean region articulates reparations as a social and economic development project attached to the Sustainable Development Goals. In the case of Canada, the suggested 12-point plan must be applied within a decolonial framework to dismantle anti-black systemic racism. This approach aligns with the UN General Assembly's 78th session recommendation urging states to address the enduring effects of enslavement and colonialism through reparative justice. The 12 tenets are: 1, an apology, as you know, for reparations to be recognized by the states as a legally binding undertaking, there needs to be a formal apology, right? 2, equity in education. Race, gender, and class play a critical role in producing unequal outcomes for black students. Towards the race and equity in education, the schooling of black students in the Greater Toronto Area report indicates that there exists a web of stereotypes that operates to racialize and marginalize this youth and structure their learning processes, social opportunities, life changes, and educational outcomes. Equity in healthcare. Research conducted by organizations like the Black Health Alliance shows that health experiences of black population show itself through lower life expectancy, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, cancer, and aggression due to the complex and multi-level impact of racism. 4, transforming the justice system. Black Canadians are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Although they contribute about 3 to 4% of Canada's population, they face higher rates of arrests, charges, and incarceration. So what does that mean? Is it that black people are inhumane, they are wild? You make 3 to 4% of the population, but you occupy a higher percentage compared to your counterpart. right? So something else is at play, right? We could make that argument, right? Most definitely. For example, research indicates that black individuals are more frequently stopped, charged, and jailed than their white counterparts. A 2019 Ontario Human Rights Commission report highlighted that black people were particularly overrepresented in police use of force incidents and carding, which, as you all know here in America, stop and frisk, right? Practices in Ontario. Point 5, access to quality housing. Currently, many urban cities in Canada are facing a housing crisis. However, anti-black racism manifests as structural, institutional, and interpersonal violence influencing how black caregivers and youth engage with the housing sector. Additionally, historical and systemic oppression is at the root of various overt factors contributing to housing instabilities among black individuals, particularly young people. 6, restoration for land. If we're speaking about reparations, we have to talk about land. Land is crucial, right? Advocates are urging for land reparations or financial compensation for black communities that have been displaced. For instance, demands have emerged for Hogan's Alleys in Vancouver, a predominantly black neighborhood demolished in the 1970s to clear the way for a highway, right? And we notice these are similar trends, right? You could look at those examples in Canada, the US, and various parts of Europe as well and realize these are happening in particular communities, right? So reparative justice needs to address this. So when I talk about a holistic approach, it's not just the financial aspect or some material benefits that's important, but it has to be interdisciplinary, interconnected, and to transform, right, uproot anti-black systemic racism, right? Point 7, equity in employment. I have underlined earlier, so I don't want to go into too detail. Anti-black systemic racism plays an essential factor in the unemployment and underemployment of black people in Canada, particularly in the public sector, right? Point 8, development and cultural institutions. Cultural institutions are important for preserving, promoting, and honoring the diverse histories, identities, and contributions of black communities in Canada. For black Canadians, these institutions serve not only as means of heritage preservation, but also to build community cohesion, fight systemic discrimination, and guarantee representation, right? Point 9, addressing the psychological traumas. And the psychological trauma piece, we are still thinking and unpacking it because we could connect it to what Professor Love DeGray mentioned, post-traumatic slave syndrome. And that tenet is also part of CARICOM 10-point plan, right? So when we're talking about addressing psychological traumas, the rates of mental health related to problems are higher in black communities. The research underscores that to address mental health within black community, there is a need to improve mental well-being and mental capital, provide early interventions, and implement new types of therapies, right? Point 10, environmental justice. Environmental justice, right? Historically, housing policies and systemic discrimination have relegated black Canadians to live near industrial zones and hazardous locations. For example, communities that I mentioned in Africville, right? Africville in Halifax were compelled to settle in areas lacking proper infrastructure and suffering from environmental decline. For instance, before Africville was dismantled, it was important to demonize the space. And what did they do at the time, the government at the time? They started dumping the garbage around Africville. So the community was surrounded by dumps, right? So it actually justified the demolition of Africville. And we have several examples of that, right? Point 11, earlier on, my colleague talked about the significance of Pan-Africanism in undertaking reparative justice. And for point 11, that's what it underlines. Black transnationalism, transatlantic slavery forcibly separated Africans from their homeland. Consequently, when black Canadians seek reparations, it is vital to approach this as a transnational effort, right? Even just the very understanding of what it is to be a black Canadian or black Canadian identities, it is something that's known to be transnational, right? For example, I am from St. Lucia. Part of my identity is the Canadian black identity. My experiences for more than half of my life, right, is based in Canada. So in most cases for Canadians, it is a transnational approach, right? When you think about people living in the African diaspora, as what Stuart Hall called, people who have been twice diasporized. You're from the Caribbean, but you live in beyond the Caribbean. So you're African diaspora, part of the African diaspora and the Caribbean diaspora, right? So it's important to have that transnational conversation, right? And the last piece, economic development. anti-black systemic racism has established structural obstacles that hinder access to essential resources. Economic development, reparations intend to eliminate these barriers by implementing equitable policies in sectors like banking. For example, guaranteeing equal access to capital and loans for black entrepreneurs so that they could enhance the economic involvement. All right? So in moving forward, so thank you. That's the 12-point plan. It's something that's not necessarily fixed, but we are in conversation with communities and activists and seeing, well, going over the data and the research to pull out common themes, right? To make a final decision on what that could look like in consultation with community as well, right? So in moving forward, the tenets of the 12-point plan are geared towards creating policies that support the overall development of black communities across Canada. Its execution does not involve necessarily confrontation with the Canadian government. Instead, it requires active collaboration among civil society, as well as partnership with the private and public sectors, to tackle the historical and ongoing injustice preventing black individuals in Canada from achieving the full potential, right? And one more thing I would like to say, in thinking through that project, it has to be in our conversations and just through speaking to my colleagues in Latin America, US, and different parts of the world, civil society plays such an important role in driving those initiatives because government changes, right? People changes, policies might change, but civil society, that's the everyday experience, that's the lived experience, right? So when government changes, doesn't mean that the lived experience changes, right? So civil society must not just be a token in that conversation, but have be crucial in the decision-making processes, have a significant role in that piece, right? So in closure, to carry out, there's one more thing I wanted to say, sorry. In regards to the 12-point plan, and I want to recognize and not ignore that certain initiatives are taking place across Canada, whether it's around education, because I know some amazing scholars, activists who are working in different sectors when it comes to the law. I could think of Michelle Williams in Nova Scotia, Carl James in Ontario, that are doing work around education and the law, and some folks are doing work in healthcare like Dr. Fatima Jackson-Best. So initiatives are being done, but it's not necessarily in alignment as a national movement. So that's what my argument is. Let's recognize the historical realities or the history of the black experiences in Canada, which will look different for people like myself who are part of the diaspora, but working together as a collective. So in moving forward, what I would like to propose is creating various provincial task forces, right? So each province/state will have a task force that will work towards the lived realities of people within that province. And the one person, one representative from that task force will be part of the national task force where we could have conversations and work together so we could address the gaps and learn from each other. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening to my spiel. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you very much.